This is Rebuilders, the leaders we need for the decade ahead. We all know change is a constant. It's just how fast, intensely, and inequitably the change around us is accelerating. As we move into the decade ahead, economic, social, and health inequalities will have created an increasingly uneven and siloed America. These changes didn't start with the events of 2020. They've been accelerating for over a generation. And now, technology, media, and COVID are amplifiers dividing us in ways we've never seen before. Our leaders need to adapt. The future of our communities and our world depend on it. But the ways we thought about leadership in the past will not get us to where we want to go in the future. America is at an inflection point, and if the right leaders show up, we will emerge from the decade ahead stronger and a better nation for everyone. This is Rebuilders, the leaders we need for the decade ahead. Here's your host, Paul Shoemaker.
I want to give a little bit of context to this episode before we dive in. Back on June 24th, I had a great conversation in connection to the book with Sudha, Nandagopal, and Cheryl Dorsey. And what I'm going to do today is basically pull out pieces of most of my conversation with them, give you a little bit of context and comments, but mostly let you listen to these two as leaders. Cheryl Dorsey is a true trailblazer in the social entrepreneurship movement. She heads up Echoing Green, which is a global nonprofit that supports emerging social entrepreneurs and invests in their leadership. Sudha Nandagopal is the CEO of Social Venture Partners International. She is a highly regarded organizer, facilitator, strategist, movement builder. She's always focused on democratizing systems of power and shifting power outward to those most affected by oppression. It was a great conversation with them. We're going to start off by talking about leadership during the pandemic and maybe how that's affected their leadership, particularly in their roles as leaders and women of color. And one thing I want to acknowledge is Cheryl's audio on this is just a little bit choppy because we did it over Zoom. I tried to clean it up as best I could. You will absolutely be able to hear the gist of what she's saying, but just know there's a few chops in Cheryl's words. I think you're going to love this conversation because it also goes in some directions and takes some detours that are even better than when we're on script.
Racial injustice that, this is a shock, once in a century shock that has led to a lot of time for reflection and thinking. And I think we know enough, those of us who sort of spend our time in the social impact sector, that at the center of a lot of what I'm going to talk about is the critical importance of trust, right? Sort of trust and leadership that's needed for transformative and collective times, especially in times like this, times of terrible uncertainty. And I think that, at the beginning, middle, and tail end of the pandemic, there's a real need for leaders to be able to instill trust in those with whom they work, right? So that was required to get folks to do preparation, planning, doing all the information, gathering, adaptation work, the need to develop a coordinated response. I think we all sort of lived through that. But, in this moment, as we're coming out of this terrible, terrible ordeal and trying to figure out how to rebuild and reimagine systems, the way we walk through the world, there's critical importance of how we sustain trust and how leaders sustain and build on that relational capital. And Paul mentioned it earlier, this absolute necessity both taking ongoing responsibility, but also accountability, and remaining closely connected to those with whom you work and whom you serve. And that also goes back to what you talked about as well, this importance of authenticity, which many ways, sort of one layer below is a sort of values-based leadership, all important, happening in real time in this unbelievable moment in which we all find ourselves.
Well, gosh, I'm hearing what Cheryl's talking about on trust, and I want to take that thread. But before I do that, I'll say, for me in this pandemic, I think, I was a year in, just having launched a new theory of change for our network, about to go, lead a whole conversation with our network about what that change would look like. And it was flipped upside down, right? And like you, Paul, I know how to do this work when it's in person, but it's really hard when you're called in for 15 minutes and you have to build relationship with someone who is in India, right? Like, how do you do that? And I will say that is still something I'm figuring out. But what I can say is I think my first response in this moment of the pandemic as a leader of a network in this nonprofit world and seeing all of my friends, right? So many of my people of color friends are running frontline organizations. And there was this sense of, we're just all drinking from the fire hose. We were doing mutual aid by spreadsheet. And I didn't sleep. I was working nonstop. I was doing things that I had never done in my career before. And it wasn't until really in the last several months that I realized, actually, as a leader, that was probably a mistake. That the most important thing I can do as a leader is actually have more spaciousness and to slow down as a counter and as a disruption to the forces around us, particularly capitalism and so many other things that just say, push, push, push until, grab every opportunity in front of you, right? And so I think for me, it's really been this learning around what does spaciousness look like? What does that evolution look like to actually be in the leadership role and the sort of communities that we need around ourselves, and to go to the trust piece, right? How do you really land yourself in a deep and trusted community? And I have been lucky enough now to have gotten to build that over the last several months. But, it was definitely rocky. And being able to now have a little bit more of that spaciousness is allowing me to see things with more clarity and move with more sort of graciousness than I was prior to this pandemic, and certainly prior to the leadership tests of this last year.
So both Sudha and Cheryl are exemplars in the book. They are exemplars of different traits. Cheryl is about cross-sector fluency, and Sudha is about complexity capacity. What we're going to talk about next is how important is that particular trait for them as they think about their leadership for the decade ahead. And just to give a quick definition of each, cross-sector fluency is about the ability of leaders to fluently, natively, not episodically or transactionally, move between all three sectors, public, private, and nonprofit. And complexity capacity is the ability of leaders to be able to take in information that is changing constantly, process it, make sense of it, and communicate it back out to the people that they're working with while the world around them continues to constantly change. So let's dive back in on those two traits with Sudha and Cheryl.
Yeah, I think it's going to be no surprise to anyone on this call, especially those who sort of traffic in the work of social innovation. It is the essential definition, right? People talk about social innovation as being an approach to driving transformational social change, but really it's an alliance-based approach to change that's all about the blurring of sectoral boundaries, right? It's how you bring the civil society, the state, and the markets in a way that creates new and shared public value. And that's sort of the work of this field and this movement. And increasingly, it's important because, we simply don't even live in market economies anymore. We live in market societies, right? We were together 50, probably even 25 years ago, and you looked at the largest GDPs around the globe, most of them would be government. literally more than half are now companies, right? So these are now sovereign enterprises that walk through the world with an extraordinary amount of power. So without having them in the conversation, it makes it very hard to determine how we could ever solve our social and environmental problems at scale, right? And I think, personally, I cut my teeth. I sort of say I'm a social justice baby. I was working on racial health disparities 30 plus years ago, and believe deeply in the power of justice-based movements to lead to transformational changes. But, it was increasingly clear that in some ways the adversarial frame that comes through some work of social justice leaders has an interesting impact of shutting down those you're talking to. And all your audience hears is, I must lose to win. It's not right, but I'm just saying that's how it lands. What was intriguing and worth me sort of spending the bulk of my professional career sort of trafficking in social innovation is, what would the frame look like through an alliance-based lens of what does a win-win value proposition look like? How do we win together through this notion of shared value creation? And that still continues to because I think ultimately it allows us all to sit together at the table to get things done.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the thing that happened last year is that things got even more complex than they have ever been before, right? I mean, it wasn't just a pandemic, right? We were also dealing with the racial justice reckoning of last summer, which hopefully will continue for, until we have real change. And so when faced with those sort of things and trying to do systems change work, where so much of the systems change, mentality is incremental, one building block at a time. And I think one of the things with thinking about complexity and in these systems is sometimes it means that we have to pull down more than one block at a time. There's a little bit of an element of disruption that can actually really help break through that complexity. And I think that's been sort of the hallmark of how I've approached some of my systems change work, with this, let's put forward a big initiative. Let's do something that really runs counter to the whole system. And that can cause a shift that is not linear. And that, I think, is, one of the things that I believe, and the ability to see the system is not because it's me seeing the system, but because I try to surround myself with trusted peers, going back to that word that Cheryl brought up, right? The trusted folks who are actually helping me see the system. Last year, about this time last year, I was connected up with a colleague who is a man of color. He's running a similar kind of organization. And we just started talking every week. And actually, I would really credit him, that's Marcus Walton, with helping me ground myself in that spaciousness, but also helping me see the system in a different way. And I think that's part of, what I think about in this freight is, how do you get enough people that you can put hands on the whole elephant, right? Because otherwise we're all just we might be making too much of just the toe of the elephant. If that metaphor translates over Zoom.
So here's where the conversations start to go in some really interesting directions. And it just struck me as I was talking to them, I wanted to know how being a leader, a woman of color, impacts their leadership, and how important is it do they think leaders like them are going to be in the decade ahead?
Sure. I mean, I think, there's something about lived experience, right? And the value that is, embedded in that concept, right? The POV, how you walk through the world, and it's how you show up in particular spaces. Some people talk about lived experience. Some people talk about proximity. But, there's a whole, and especially I'm probably 2 generations ahead of Sudha, but, to have been early in my career, fairly invisibilized, right? So, my favorite experiment when I was a pediatric resident was when I had my white coat on with my stethoscope draped around my neck on call to be in conversation with my fellow residents or my attending physicians. But the moment I took it off, people would zip right by me in the hallway because I was no longer seen, right? And what does that look like? I mean, to me, that's sort of the perfect example of, the caste system come to light, right? So again, I sort of worship at the altar of Isabel Wilkerson, who really, I think, sort of beautifully talks about caste as an artificial hierarchy that determines not only your standing, but the level of respect you receive and the assumptions that are made about you, as well as who gets or who does not get access to resources. And that's how certainly many folks like me sort of walk through the world. I'm the last year of being a baby boomer. So I would say sort of that sort of the accumulated weight of sort of systemic, racism, systemic patriarchy, class considerations. It's the sediment that builds up, and it both sort of weighs you down and slows you down, but it also heightens your sense of responsibility. When I look at a young woman like Sudha, like I got to be in the game for her. I got to be able to pass the baton. I got to block and tackle in a way. And it is absolutely my responsibility. And I am accountable to her. And it matters to me. Right. So, as the kids say, you become ride or die in how you show up for the next generation. And it is not at all a burden, but it is a gift that you get to share. Yeah, I think we matter, right? I think we matter in terms of the narrative. Representation matters, right? We matter demographically. We know talent is equally distributed. Opportunity is not. We're not going to be able to get done what we need to get done without having smart, capable, competent voices with different lived experience at the table. Like, we just can't get the work done. And increasingly, I would say, like, my hair was not this great when the pandemic started, and part of it, I can't see my hairdresser. But also, it's now existential. We are trying to birth the truly multiracial democracy. At the moment, I'm not sure we're going to make it. Like, I'm really scared. Until you've got all of us fighting together, the seat at the table, the role of, civil society leaders like us, folks of color, women of color, who've got to be in the work of tending to and, in fact, saving our democracy. It really matters. It really does.
Well, first off, I'll say to that, if I am following in the footsteps of Cheryl, I am excited for that path because I have, this is the first time we're getting to talk to each other, but I have long looked up to and appreciated her leadership journey. And also we share that we both, she's far more advanced in her biology training as a doctor, but I also come from being a biologist by training. So, I always love meeting my fellow scientists in the social impact world. But what I will say to the thing about being a woman of color in this work is, and I'm actually part of a cohort now that is majority women of color executives, my Rockwood team. And it's been really interesting to talk about this challenge that women of color are facing right now as we take on leadership roles, particularly in philanthropy. I'm in a philanthropic sector that is definitely, this donor educating organizing sphere is very white, and it's a very white male leadership, right? And so there's so few of us in this sector, there's so few in philanthropy, period, that one of the things that a lot of us are finding ourselves having to do is both be the first person in that role, be the first woman of color, and also explain to people what that means. And it was only recently that I sort of grappled with that in that way and understood, okay, so every time I'm not only trying to do the work, I'm also trying to explain to people the complications that I faced while doing the work. And I'm much better at doing the work than I am about talking about the complications I faced doing the work. And I'm much better at seeing another woman of color leader. And this is why, as Cheryl spoke about, bringing up other women of color into this work. Really, one of my deep commitments is that I see myself as someone who opens the door for other folks. Not, it should not stop with me. I should not be the first and last, but I should bring a lot of people of color behind me into this work. But I do think there's this struggle, how much we're expected as we walk into a room to help people understand what our situation is versus just being able to show up in the room fully in my expertise. Right. And that tension is something I've certainly felt working in government, working in philanthropy, and in these majority white spaces where I think, and this goes to that piece about trust again, right? Who's afforded trust? Who gets the benefit of trust when they walk in the room, and who has to earn trust? And I think one of the things that I have experienced is that as a woman of color, I have to earn trust from those who have power and who have had power for, generations in these systems. And sometimes people like yourself, Paul, are able to give that third-party validation and boost me up to have that trust. But I definitely experience that kind of like holding back, that positional leaning back of people, as opposed to the leaning in that I experience when I'm in a room of people who all say, okay, we're going to give each other the benefit of trust.
So this conversation just keeps getting better and deeper, and we're going in some unique directions. And the next thing we're going to talk about for a couple of minutes is having Cheryl talk to us about what role trust plays in all this work. Because I think trust is a really cross-cutting theme. It's an undercurrent, if you will. It's really sort of embedded in many or all of those 5 vital traits. So let's hear Cheryl talk about trust.
Yeah, I mean, I'll sort of go back to the research that Echoing Green did with Rich Band last year on, barriers to capital for leaders of color, for Black leaders, but it's also relevant to Latinx, other folks of color, very intersectional, especially for women of color. And underneath sort of the numbers, like the disparity between the amount that Black leaders in our network were able to raise relative to their white Echoing Green fellow counterparts, especially unrestricted net assets. Like for those who haven't read the research, we found that our Black fellows were raising 24% less revenue relative to their white counterparts, but 76% less unrestricted net assets. And our conclusion was that was a proxy for lack of trust. Like ding, 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 right? And, when you get underneath the numbers, one more layer, it was like, what's driving all of this? And our shared conclusion was the 3 drivers were conceptions around risk, who was a risk, who was worthy, who's not, right? How you start to weaponize risk to keep people out, sort of the concept of bias, right? Where you got pattern recognition in our sector and in all sectors about what success looks like and who it looks like. And then just concept of power. Sudha spoke to this, like when you are not either given power, power is not shared, it's not ceded, it's not afforded you, how that sort of keeps you out of the game. And there are real world implications for leaders, for the organizations we run, and for our ability or lack thereof to drive impact in the world. And at a moment when house on fire, you would think you got to tag more of us in. So then the question becomes, how do you then begin to pivot and start to think about solutions?
The last section that I'm going to set up is just a really important conversation that we had about are the leadership traits that we need from white men different than the traits we need from women of color leaders and BIPOC leaders, and also trying to understand how white leaders like myself can best relate to and work with and connect to and support and be mutually supportive with leaders of color like Cheryl and Sudha.
I mean, I can jump in quickly and just say, like, this is only from my experience, but there is a donor who's been with me in my career now for several years. He was a funder of my work when I was at the city, and he continues to fund SVP now. And he and I caught up for a little conversation, and he said to me, he was like, Sudha, what is it that you need? I really want to make sure that I'm supporting you and I'm doing what you need to be helpful. And he was like, but also now I'm funding other women of color leaders. So is there anything when you think back to our first conversations that you wish I had done? And that openness, first of all, that he asked that question, but then the opportunity of what I said to him was, you know what? I wish that it hadn't just been a conversation between the two of us. I wish that you had talk to my board, and offered that, right? Because I don't think I even knew at the time, like, oh, I should have him come and talk to my board, because I'm over here, I can own my own story. I can tell my own story. I figured I didn't need someone else to do that with my board. But now he's doing that with another woman of color that I know and that he's funding, and he's supporting her board. And it's actually really transformational because he's able to position himself in a different way. But what he's doing is really wrapping around her and around me a body of support that is, hard to find in this work. And so I'll share that as an example of kind of that gate opening and relational way of showing up that's very different than saying, hey, I'm already an expert, which I think, for a lot of particularly people, white men, white women, there's a lot that says to you, like, you're an expert in this room, go forth, continue to be an expert. And I really have appreciated how he has shown up and said, hey, there are areas where I'm not an expert. And how can I support you, though, even with the pieces of things that I do have expertise in?
I'm kind of just like a very practical person. And again, I think great leaders, right? These traits are the same, but, in this particular moment, how you show up, and I'll give 3 examples. So there's I'm looking here at Jude on my screen. I get to work with Jude because, we've been colleagues forever, but I joined the Skoll board a little over a year ago and get to work closely with Jude and his colleagues. And I see how his colleague, Don Gibbs, has shown up at Skoll in this moment, sort of a white man who has drawn in a racial justice grant-making pillar, which is brand new for Skoll. And I'm not sure anyone but Don could have done that, right, for this foundation in this moment, right? So using his positional authority in a really powerful way. Second example I'll give is just because I'm on the board of Bridge Band and I get to work closely with the Bridge Band folks, and to see the way that Jeff Braddock has walked through the world using his positional authority for, pretty much the top nonprofit consulting firm in our sector, who said, we care mostly about impact, but we cannot get to impact maximization until we do our work through a race-informed lens. What? Right? If I said it, no one was going to listen. If Sudha said it, no one was going to listen. Well, maybe a few people, but not the way that when Jeff Braddock says it, game-changing. And I got to say, when I saw President Joe Biden go to Tulsa and talk about the Tulsa race massacre and use very explicit language that he can use as a 70-year-old baby boomer white guy, powerful, sort of the narrative force that he brought using his leadership in that moment, again, really extraordinarily powerful. So it's how you use that leadership credibility and cachet. How do you cash in those chits when you need it? And it's been wonderful to see so many white male leaders doing that. It's amazing.
Just a last summary comment. I hope everybody enjoyed and was enriched as much as I was by the conversation with the two of them. And I just want to thank Sudha and Cheryl again for taking an hour of their day to talk to me not only about their books, about the book, but about their own personal leadership journeys, which are so powerful for all of us.
Thank you for listening to the Rebuilders Podcast. For more information, resources, and episodes, visit paulshoemaker.org. That's paulshoemaker.org.